Welcome back to Neal on Fire, where we talk with the people building the future of wildfire detection, mitigation, and response. Just a quick note for listeners, Neal on Fire is provided purely as a service to spotlight wildfire innovation. I am not paid for this podcast. Today, we're talking about something that comes up in every conversation about wildfire that I've been a part of, and that is wildfire situational awareness. Not just detection, not just satellite imagery, but decision-grade intelligence. My guest today is Holly Eagleston, the CEO of Firescape.ai, a company focused on turning complex wildfire data into actionable information. Welcome to the podcast, Holly.
Thanks, Neal.
To start off, I would love for you to give listeners a bit of background. I understand that before starting Firescape, you led a team of scientists and engineers in developing wildfire risk models at Sandia National Labs. How did that experience inform the creation of Firescape?
Yeah, I worked at Sandia National Labs for about 6 years, and we were focused on wildfire risk and energy security and different projects for Department of Energy. And it definitely came up a lot with utilities where there's an ongoing and growing threat of wildfire risk and trying to understand how to mitigate for it to be proactive rather than reactive. And so we worked on a lot of remote sensing technologies to understand what's going on with vegetation characteristics and the likelihood of an ignition carrying a fire, the likelihood of the electric grid starting a fire, and then also the impacts to surrounding communities and what the utilities could do in terms of mitigating for it with fire protection settings on their system. So doing things like public safety power shutoffs, for example. And so after that experience, really focusing on the science and the modeling efforts, it just seemed like there was such a huge need in the industry for this. And at that time, it was right before the California fires, but we had the Smokehouse Creek fire in Texas, which was the largest fire in the US, over 1 million acres. And so at that point, me and my co-founder really decided that we wanted to create this business, bring the software and the modeling out into industry so that we could start to help utilities on the ground with mitigating some of these disasters.
When you started the company, what gap were you trying to fill in the existing wildfire response ecosystem that wasn't being addressed?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of other wildfire modeling solutions out there, but I think there's a real gap for utilities who don't already have deep experience in wildfire science, meteorology, data science, and so utilities that are a little bit smaller or new to wildfire. So a lot of the utilities in Texas, the Midwest, even the East Coast are now thinking about wildfire and what to do about it. And they don't have those in-house teams like some of the California utilities have. So our software is really focused on doing all the science behind the scenes and then providing the utility with just the information that they need and some of the data and recommendations behind it, but making it really user-friendly and streamlined and making it accessible where you don't need a PhD in wildfire science to understand what's going on with energy release component. How does that impact how a fire might spread? We just give the utilities what they need to know. This is where you need to do a mitigation and make it really easy for them.
Speaking of not needing a PhD and making it easy, can you explain just in plain language how Firescape fits into decisions that users are making before, during, and after wildfires?
Yeah, so we're really focused on the prevention side. That's our whole mission, is to prevent any kind of electric grid caused wildfire. And so we're bringing in satellite imagery, weather data, we're running wildfire simulations, and we're using AI with the remote sensing data, so all the satellite imagery, to then predict things like what's going on with fuel moisture, what's going on with wind speed, how, if a fire started here, where would it go, how many buildings might it impact, what's the consequence of it. And we combine all those things into a final score that then the utility can use to decide that this particular section of line should go on public safety power shutoff because the risk of starting a high consequence fire is just too high. So it's all focused on the prevention, and so they'll get a email alert and a notice up to 7 days before a particular event, and our data updates every hour. And then during the event, they'll be looking at weather station data, which is also hosted in our platform. And they'll be having people out in the field looking at conditions and continuing to make those decisions and think about impacts and how to quickly restore power. And then afterwards, it's focused on that restoration. So when everything's re-energized, they first have to patrol the lines and look at what kind of has a tree fallen into the power line because of the wind events. They then need to clear it. So our software can also help them with optimizing that re-energization process and putting crews where they need to go first to quickly get things back online.
So I think you answered this question already, but one of the things that comes up is there's all kinds of data out there, ground sensor data, there's remote sensing data, everything out there. There's tons of sources from the government, as you're familiar with. And the question is, how does that all get put into a system that provides more like a dashboard with very easy to understand indicators? And it sounds like you're providing a scoring mechanism that will allow users to easily understand the wildfire risk at any point in time. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's kind of two challenges that we're trying to solve. So one is a lot of this data is siloed. So you can go and look at, what the weather data is by going to the National Weather Service, for example. You can look at the National Interagency Fire Center data and NCWeb for what's going on with fire, as well as new tools like Watch Duty, for example. But how to integrate all that information in a way that's relevant to utilities has been a challenge, and a lot of utilities end up having to look at like 10 different screens. And so we integrate all of that for them. So it's all in one place. And then, being able to then use a data-driven approach and apply some of the remote sensing and machine learning to provide that proprietary risk score to make it really simple for utilities to understand what the conditions are that might require a certain mitigation for a per circuit or per asset level type of granularity is the other service then that we provide.
And what kind of data are you integrating today? I heard you talk about remote sensing from satellites, talked about ground sensors. How many different sources, I guess, are you integrating into the system?
Yeah, there's quite a few different data sets that we're pulling. So for the satellite imagery, we're pulling multispectral satellite imagery to then understand characteristics like fuel moisture and also looking at things like vegetation density, the type of surface fuel model it is, which is really relevant for the fire spread modeling. And then for weather data, we're pulling in several different models. That's all from open source, looking at the HER data, the high resolution rapid refresh that comes from NOAA, looking at the European models, the GFS models, and then we actually do an in-house downscaling for the wind data where we can provide much higher spatial granularity. So for example, the HER data is available at 3 kilometers. And so you'll get a single value for a 3 kilometer by 3 kilometer pixel. And with our downscaling, we can get that down to 50 meters where it's terrain informed. So you're seeing how wind patterns interact with the terrain. So you're getting those downslope winds, the canyon winds. It's much more granular. And then being able to pull all that information into the wildfire spread modeling makes those models much more accurate. And then we also bring in weather station data as well. So anything that is publicly available, like the raw stations or Mesonet, MesoWest, and then some of the utilities even have their own weather stations. So when we work with a utility, we can pull in their data into that as well.
Rough order of magnitude, if you can share it, how many different sources do you think you bring in at any given time?
It's probably at least like 10 to 20 different data sets that we're bringing in and processing to then provide that final analysis. Yeah.
So have you developed some kind of a system internally? Because each of these systems typically has, or data sets, I should say, has a different API. It's got a different data structure, and you're trying to map it to your system. You must have a data engineer or a number of engineers that sit there and try to figure out how to bring all this into your system.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, that's a big challenge. And so, yeah, we have about 10 folks on the team now. So we have several data engineers, software engineers that are doing all that work to integrate everything and crunch everything so it's ready in the platform.
As you shared, Firescape is primarily focused on the utility market. Is there a reason why you wouldn't be able to support other customers, whether they be state and local, federal, private forestry, whatever it may be, who would like to have that same information? Or do you feel like because of the nature of utilities, it's really dedicated for that kind of purpose?
Yeah, so far we've focused the product on electric grid utilities because we're layering in a lot of the ignition likelihood information as if a fire were to start from a utility. But there's certainly a lot of we also run fire spread forecasts, for example, and look at the time of arrival of a fire to certain assets. So I think with some of the advances that we've made in the input data that goes into the fire simulation models that then improve some of those fire spread accuracies, it would probably be of interest also to some of the fire suppression folks as well as other groups like insurance. So that's something that we've been exploring as expanding into those areas. But right now we're focused on the electric grid utilities.
Understood. You and a number of other companies, so I have to ask the question, where do you see the differentiator in Firescape versus similar tools with similar kinds of capabilities that are being offered or coming to market?
Yeah, like I mentioned, we're really focused on making it user friendly and providing the utilities with the information that they need right now. And so it increases the speed of decision making. So when you think about doing a public safety power shutoff, there's huge impacts to the community associated with that. And there's a lot of different trade offs to think about. And then also the weather is constantly evolving, fuel conditions are evolving. So there's a lot of back and forth and different simulations that could be run. And so what we do is really streamline that whole process. So instead of, requiring a user to run their own simulation, analyze the data, think about what the impacts are, talk to 5 other teams internally. We've done all of that behind the scenes, and then we provide you need to do this mitigation at this circuit. So it makes the decision making a lot faster and repeatable and defensible. And so I think that really appeals to some of the utilities who are having to deal with rapidly changing conditions with PSPS and also who maybe haven't done a PSPS before and where it's kind of new to them. So again, just kind of taking out some of the challenges with it around analyzing vast amounts of data and just really streamlining it has been our focus.
So we talked about the Firescape tool being primarily focused on advanced notice of wildfires for utilities. Do you also see it being of use during a wildfire event, or is it primarily to identify where there is a potential issue that might arise?
Yeah, we do both. I mean, the focus on preventing a fire, that's where we have the different settings for recommending non-reclose or one shots, and then public safety power shutoffs is all about preventing a wildfire. Once a fire starts, do have in our software, we're bringing in dispatch data, we're bringing in satellite thermal imagery, data from NIFC. So we're tracking wildfires, and then we also forecast spread from there and what the impacts and response might be for a utility. So once a fire is started, we provide some of the data to help them respond to it as well.
When I think about most utilities, you have an operations center that is staffed 24/7. They've got screens all over the place. Does Firescape require an additional screen that they're going to need to look at, or are you looking at interoperability with their existing tools, or both?
Yeah. The workflow right now is, it starts with those alerts. So they'll get an email alert anytime there's a particular mitigation action that they should take. And then to get more details, they would then go into our platform. So it would be another screen that they're looking at, but it already integrates all their asset data, all their GIS data is in there, the weather data, the weather station data, everything's kind of integrated. And then we have been working on integrating with more of their operations teams too, to think about doing automated handshakes between what the software recommends and, a SCADA enabled not recloser setting. So when the software recommends something, they could automatically change a recloser setting, still with a human in the loop, but being able to integrate across their systems.
So let's talk about a few use cases. So if I'm a utility and I want to use Firescape for identifying potential wildfire events well in advance, first of all, because we're integrating weather and a lot of other data feeds, what tools might I be replacing if I took on Firescape?
So again, we're trying to, especially with utilities who don't already have a wildfire risk tool, we're trying to help them consolidate all that information. So instead of looking at a weather dashboard, even like windy.com or something, and then also looking at a fire dashboard, and then looking at some of their operations dashboards, we're kind of integrating all of those things at once. And then looking at some of the utilities who already have some tools also, I think there's definitely a movement in the field where very much like weather modeling, where you're looking at, sometimes even 10 different weather models and trying to understand model agreement. I think fire modeling's moving to that direction too, because there's a lot of different folks that are building out models slightly different ways, slightly different approaches. You're going to get different outputs. And so, in the same way that you're looking at weather models and understanding model agreement across them, and some do better in certain areas than others, I think fire modeling is going to be the same way, where a end user might have multiple fire models that they're looking at, but it would all could all be integrated into one place for them to understand the differences.
So back to that last example. So if I'm using the tool and I think you said I would get a text message of a potential wildfire event, is that right?
An email alert, yeah.
Email alert. Okay. So is there a phone app or is this strictly a web-based system?
Right now it's web-based. We are looking at getting it mobile compatible in the future. Yeah.
Okay. So this is really going to be part of like a wildfire operations center primarily, and not as much where someone's going to be carrying an app that's going to give them early alerts, somebody who's in the field who's not necessarily tethered to a screen in the office.
Yeah, it's more for the operations teams in the office to understand, what kind of critical decisions they need to make given conditions as they're changing.
So I know you've got this being evaluated by a number of utilities. Have you received any early feedback, any thoughts around maybe how it replaces other tools that they're using and makes it easier to keep an eye on wildfires?
Yeah, we're piloting with a few utilities right now. And some of the feedback we've gotten is about how it's helped them in the granularity of data that we're giving them. For example, when one utility who didn't have any kind of fire detection or fire weather solution before was relying on the National Weather Service red flag warnings. And those are really, they encompass a large area because they're issued by the fire weather zone. So it could be, hundreds of square miles within that area. And our data is able to take that and distill it down to that 3 kilometer pixel level. And so now they're seeing, instead of during a red flag warning, they would do non-reclosed settings across their whole territory within that zone. They're able to do it recloser by recloser so that they're just applying to certain sections of line. And so what that does is it still protects against a potential fire start but also balancing reliability, because when they go on that non-reclosed setting, then their customers are much more likely to experience an outage up to 2 to 3 times as much. And so it allows them to reduce the number of outages without sacrificing safety by being much more granular about where they're applying these different settings.
So, what is the AI component? What's the benefit of AI in your system? What's it offering the customer in terms of integrating all this together and providing the alerts?
Yeah, so when we use AI, we're not talking about large language models at all. We are bringing in the satellite data, so all that multispectral data, pixelized data. We're training to different ground conditions, and we're using tools or models, like random forest or CNN models, to then be able to understand that relationship between the ground station information or any kind of field collected data and what the satellite sees, so that we can then forecast across an entire area and have a wall-to-wall product for something like fuel moisture, for example. So that's where we're using AI models to then provide some of these wall-to-wall geospatial layers to understand spatial heterogeneity and complexities across terrain and vegetation.
So, with the advent of satellite data that is coming in for resources that we never had before, I mean, what do you see being able to offer in the future in the platform that you haven't before or you can't do today?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting growth in the commercial satellite imagery space, especially with fire detection. Like FireSat was just launched, for example, so having much higher resolution thermal data coming in, both spatial resolution and temporal resolution, is a huge benefit, because, looking at some of the thermal data that's available through open source, looking at VIIRS data or MODIS data, you might only have 1 or 2 collections a day. So being able to get something that's, every hour, every 5 minutes even, is hugely beneficial in terms of situational awareness data on the ground, and then being able to apply some of the forecasting fire spread models to that, where you have refresh data that's, almost near real time. I think that's going to just be getting better and better as we're seeing more of these investments in different satellites and capabilities. There's also, other multispectral satellites coming online, even hyperspectral. So being able to really understand the vegetation conditions, even to the species level, and then being able to map things like fuel moisture or flammability characteristics is just going to continue to improve some of our inference that we can make from the satellite imagery.
So I think given that you're a repository for all of this data, you can go out and work with different satellite providers, get different imagery that you might not have today, and provide value well beyond what somebody might otherwise get from just working with that satellite provider by themselves, in more of an integrated solution, bringing together real actionable data as opposed to just imagery itself.
Exactly. Yeah, and being able to get the insights you need from that data in a way that's going to work with your operations teams or your business model, I think is huge, because having access to the data is one thing. Being able to do something with it and understand it's a completely another ballgame.
Wildfire technology is notoriously challenging. What has been the hardest part of building Firescape so far?
Things definitely change a lot. So we've had a lot of issues where, the data, even, we had the government shutdown happen last fall. So we were, one data source we were using was government data, and it was no longer available during the government shutdown. And so we had to quickly pivot and look at some other commercially available data, and then create a model that could essentially replicate the wildfire potential index that the USGS normally puts out. So definitely being you have to be kind of nimble to the different data sets that are out there and the constraints that they have, especially as the government climate has changed, where some things are no longer available. Some of the in-car data sets are starting to be archive. So being able to kind of be nimble across all these different data sets that are available, and then also working with some of the national labs or other universities as well. So we have a CRADA right now with Los Alamos National Labs, where we're working with them on some of the physics-based modeling. So I think, not relying on one data source and looking across different types of data sets and being agile with that is definitely something you have to be prepared for with this type of data.
Well, it sounds like from your time at Sandia that you have an inside track on government data sources, and you mentioned Los Alamos, people, within the government world. I'm curious, as you made this transition out of government into the commercial space to develop Firescape, there must have been a bit of a culture clash because you were used to working in the government sector and now you went to create a startup. What's been the biggest challenge in terms of going from that environment to being a startup?
It's a huge culture change. It's something that I was really excited for, though, and something that I was craving. So, definitely a huge change in some of the kind of priorities and the pacing of things. And, we had a lot of really good work that came out of Sandia National Labs while I was there, but you do have to do a lot of paperwork and a lot of kind of bureaucracy stuff, and things don't always go as quickly as you would hope. Versus doing the startup, you're doing everything yourself. So you're wearing 10 hats and you're working really long hours to get stuff done, but you get a lot more done quickly. And so we were able to stand up our platform within 3 months and have something operational and have utilities start to use it. And so being able to see that build really quickly and get people using it was really rewarding compared to, just putting out like a research paper or something from the work that I did before.
Yes, there is a big difference between government sector and private sector, and I'm glad you're
Yeah.
experiencing that. That's great. So tell me, we've talked a lot about Firescape, and it's been really interesting to hear all about it and the history and what you're planning to do in the future. Is there anything that we missed that you think it's important for listeners to hear about that we didn't cover?
I mean, I think it's just really important to understand how nuanced some of the issues are around wildfire and response to wildfire. And, one thing I've learned a lot here working with some of the utilities is that it's a much more complex decision than it might seem like from the outside for how you prevent and mitigate fires. And it's not just about the public safety power shutoffs, it's also about investing in grid hardening. So a lot of utilities are investing in undergrounding, for example. I think PG&E had pledged billions of dollars to do that. And some of the utilities outside of California can't always afford to do that level of investment. And so looking at all the different tools they have available to them and why they're making a decision about doing covered conductors in one location or updating fuses in another, and then doing public safety power shutoffs. There's a lot of different pieces that go into the whole spectrum for wildfire mitigation. And I've been really excited to be part of that data-driven approach and preventative measures rather than seeing utilities be more reactive to it. And so I think more and more utilities are starting to embrace that preventative aspect. And so that's been really good to see across the industry, and it's really exciting to be a part of it.
This has been a great conversation about Firescape and the future of wildfire intelligence. Holly, thanks again for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
If you found this conversation useful, please subscribe to Neal on Fire wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay tuned for the next episode of Neal on Fire.